The best way to try to begin a discussion on firearms is I want you to imagine that I walked in here and right on this table I put down a 9mm handgun Glock right here. Nice 45 or whatever, right here on the table. It's here, it's standing there. The fact that I did that would probably elicit three separate and distinct reactions. There are some people that would look at that weapon, or that firearm, if you will, and they would look at it, and they would look at it with a sense of awe and fear. Their attitude would be, wow, I want to get away from that as far as I can, almost as though it was possessed with demonic spirits, okay? They would flee from it, reject it outright. The second reaction would be a little bit more devious. Somebody would be looking at that thing and they would be saying, with that I can get what I want, and I can pay back some people I've been waiting to pay back a few years, unfortunately, all right? The third reaction would be one that I would characterize as follows. First, it would be familiarity. It would be confidence. There would be respect for the piece of machinery that was laid before them. There would be a familiarity with it. There would be a certain sobriety about how this individual conducts themselves. And this would be a person of restraint, judgment, and good character, and would be prepared, if necessary, to defend themselves with it, but would also be very, very cautious about the circumstances and the ramifications for what that decision might incur. What I've just described to you is three separate personalities, and I would submit to you that the last one is the American ideal. Right? Now, you can draw a distinct parallel between the description I just gave you now about those three reactions to the whole concept of freedom itself. Okay? Some people are afraid of freedom. They don't want anything to do with it. They want somebody to watch them, take care of them. They want anything done for them. Right? Others come in and are abusive of freedom. They see freedom as license to do whatever they want without responsibility. And then the third views freedom as a critical and essential part of human experience, human development, respects it, and tries to utilize that freedom to make a contribution and to better themselves and others. Again, paralleling the American ideal. So when we talk about firearms, we are talking about a freedom that is inextricably tied to who we are as people, as Americans. And I'm going to try to lay that out for you a little bit. If there was one distinct difference between an American and someone from outside of the United States, and I would use probably European background in particular, there would be a distinct difference in the way that handguns or firearms or rifles would be viewed. Complete difference. Probably one of the most remarkable and definitive cultural differences between an American and anybody else in the world is their relationship towards a firearm. Okay? And there's a reason for that. And the reason can be found in history. Go back, most of the world, and including Europe, was basically locked in and mired in a certain feudalism for many, many years. In that society, most people did not have weapons. They were not entitled to have weapons. Weaponry was entitled for only the nobility. The ability to engage in combat was a privilege reserved for the nobility and no one else. Anybody that stepped out of that line was subject to be killed, murdered, okay, punished. Now, to understand what the nobility was like, you know, we have a romanticized version of what we think feudalism was with the kings and nobles and everything else. I want to make it a more realistic thing for you. I want you to think of yourself as living in the community of Chelmsford, and Whitey Bulger runs it. All right? Without any appeal, without any recourse. He's the boss, and you do what he says. If you can get that picture in your mind, you'll start to understand what feudalism was like, and you'll understand what drove people from there to here, and why we have changed and altered our viewpoints as opposed to what happened back there. Now, the New World, the United States of America, which it ultimately became, offered a commoner, a person who had no standing, the opportunity to finally break out of that system of feudalism, to come here and to be free. But there was a price for that. The price was two things. Number one, complete peril. There was absolutely no defense from animals, from bad crops, from enemies. You were on your own. Okay? King lets you come. King says it's fine, but don't expect the crown to provide you any troops. And when they finally did, they made you pay for it. All right? The second thing is you're on your own. That's it. You are completely self-sufficient. Whether you survive or thrive is entirely upon you. And that is the history of the land that we stand on and sit here tonight. I invite you to take a ride someday. Particularly, I have always been fascinated with this region up here. You go to the town of Groton, for example, and I'm sure Chelmsford has its history here, but Groton struck me because I was in Groton recently and I just read the plaque on the front of the Groton Town Hall. Between 1705 and 1756, Groton was settled and resettled 5 times. That's because it was burnt down 5 times. Okay? Haverhill was burnt down. Worcester was burnt down. All right? They had to close Groton because nobody would come out and settle it. And why was that? Because as we see today, for example, in the Middle East, this little corridor up through here, up along the Merrimack River, out along Route 2, the old Mohawk Trail, was basically the front lines in a colonial war between France and England. And what was happening was both the French and the English, utilizing their Native American allies for both sides, would promote and foster and provoke confrontations and wars between the two. And these border town areas were right in the middle. And it was in these areas that the whole concept of self-defense, self-preservation really took hold. It was a do-or-die situation, and the people here chose to do, not die. Now, colonists developed a certain survival mentality, and I have been in the security business for many, many years. And the first item, or the first issue for discussion in any discussion about security is your survival mentality. It means that you are convinced and are focused and are determined to defend yourself against an attack no matter what. You will do what necessary to defend yourself or those that you love. Don't accept that as taken for granted, because it's not. There's a psychological differentiation between people. Some people have that, other people don't. That's why you see people victimized. Okay? Survival mentality is a determination to live. It's a determination to do what is necessary to protect yourself and to protect those that you love. And that is what the experience in the colonial American times engendered into the United States, into American culture. And it's very important to understand that. For example, 1623, Virginia. You couldn't go to church on Sunday unless you brought a well-armed rifle, well-oiled, well-serviceable firearm, and sufficient ammunition to help defend the colony. 1632, Plymouth Colony. Same thing. You had to have a weapon. You had to have a firearm. You had to be prepared to defend yourself and as well as join a collective defense when necessary against serious incursions by hostile elements. This experience went on for about 100 years, and it had a dramatic impact on our revolutionary period and the way that our thinking was shaped and our founders and the influences that they took. Let me just talk to you a little bit. When they began to look at law prior to the colonial experience, law was viewed as divine right. It was promulgated from above. In the colonial experience, our concept became that law was derived from the consent of the governed, the people who had formed a contract together to provide for their common defense. They were the ones who put the law together. And those laws began, the first item on the issue was the right of self-defense. In fact, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison, and Adams all referred to it as the first law of nature, which is your right to defend yourself. No one else is going to do it. Yours is the first right. Now, there were probably about 4 reasons why people needed to be armed back then, and some of them still exist today. The first is a need for collective defense. That is, for example, if you were confronted by a large hostile force, you had to be able to muster enough people to be able to repel that force. So, ergo, we have the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Company of Massachusetts, which it extends its roots and lineage back to that time. Okay? The second thing was personal defense. True, there were sheriffs, but a sheriff wasn't going to be on patrol in a mobile car back in the frontier times. If you're living out in Groton, or you're living out in Plymouth, or you're living out in the Connecticut River, anybody could come to your front door. Hostile elements, or just plain old-fashioned robbers, and try to take what you have. And it was up to you to protect and defend yourself. The second thing was food. If you needed to supplement if you had a bad crop, which was very, very common in New England at the time, you had to supplement that food by going out and shooting game. And you had the right to do that, and your firearm was important. And then the fourth one, which I think is very important and very, very overlooked, is a tradition in British law. Early colonists here came with roots to English common law. And there was a commentary. There's a famous legal scholar on law by the name of Blackstone. They call it Blackstone Commentaries. And in Blackstone Commentaries, there's a dissertation about the rights of the citizen to be able to defend and promote their interest and defend their vital interests. And there's a three-step process to it, recognized in common law. The first is the courts. You take your issue to court. That's the first place you bring your grievance. If that doesn't work out, you petition your legislature. You try to petition your legislature. You get people to agree and go to wherever it is that the legislative body is sitting and try to effect a change. The last is armed rebellion. It's a recognized component in Blackstone's commentary, which I was very, very impressed. I said, wow. I said, I didn't realize that it was that way. So how did this begin to affect the United States of America and its formulation as a country? Well, all of you are familiar with this, right? The Constitution of the United States, I'm sure. And the Second Amendment specifies what the body politic and their representatives believed in 1792, I believe, it was 1787. And it was this: a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about this over the last 50 years. I can remember most of my life. One of the key issues is well-regulated militia. What is a militia? There are some who argue that a militia is a organized, formal military force run by the state or by the federal government or some other body politic that's authorized to do it, and that represents what the Second Amendment was supposed to mean. But I would submit to you that there is sufficient information and sufficient evidence, if you will, in the record that would indicate that that's not what it meant, and I'm going to share some of that information with you. The first indication, or the first kind of clarification of what this means, is the Militia Act of 1792, which was the first federal law ever passed. This law recognized that the militia was specifically not the Continental Army. It was not any organized military force. It was every male citizen in the United States who was required to possess a firearm and a minimum supply of ammunition. And the age of that militia was age 17 to 45. You were automatically drafted back in those days. You didn't have to serve, but you had to be ready to come if you were called. Now, the Massachusetts Constitution provides even more interesting insight. In the Massachusetts Constitution, which, by the way, is older than the United States Constitution, addresses the right to bear arms under Article 17, and it's a very important site. You should probably write this down. It specifies that the people have a right to keep and bear arms for the common defense. Then it goes on to say, as in time of peace, armies are dangerous to liberty. They ought not to be maintained without the consent of the legislature, and the military power shall always be held in exact subordination to that of the citizens. That line is very important. That phrase is very important because it shows you that there was no intent to transfer the right or to equate the right of the people to bear arms to an organized military organization. That was not the case in Massachusetts. Okay? It's not the case in Virginia. It's not the case in the Second Amendment. It is your right to keep and bear arms as members and citizens of this country. Now, there's a very interesting provision of the law, which I had the opportunity at one point to research right after 9/11, when I was still in the state police. I was asked to do some research for some policy decisions, and I found that Massachusetts, and I'm probably sure New Hampshire is no different, Massachusetts actually has a statute that governs what is called the organized and the unorganized militia. Okay? And I would refer you to Massachusetts General Law, Chapter 33, Section 3. Now, there is an organized militia. There is a military adjutant in charge of that. But there is also what is called an unorganized militia. And that is every male subject, again, age 17 to I think it's 60 in Massachusetts, is subject to this. And it is not to be called up, but only in these circumstances: war or actual threatened war, invasion or prevention of invasion, assisting civil officers in the execution of laws. And I found this one recently, which was not there in 2001, threats to the homeland security. Now, I don't know who put that one in, but that's a very interesting provision. All right? So that means at some point in time, you could be called to be able to take action, to be able to take a post, to be able to assume a responsibility for the defense of this country. And as we're watching it develop on the news, that once remote possibility is looking ever and ever more possible, if you'll agree with me on that. So that's the constitutional overview. Again, the law, your right to bear arms, is inextricably tied to your identity as an American citizen. It is part and parcel of your citizenship. And I think I've just explained to you the reasons why. So now let's take a look at the Massachusetts law, the gun laws. Let's walk through them and try to get a feel for how Massachusetts has adjusted and drafted and worked with this law through particularly the recent times. I would submit to you that the Massachusetts gun law, as it stands now, has gone through 3 phases. The first phase was changes made in 1974 called the Bartley-Fox gun law, which I think a few of you will probably remember that. The second changes came in 1999, which were the post-Columbine school changes, the incident in Columbine. And then the last one was 2014, which were the post-Sandy Hook changes made to the law. 3 separate impacts on the law. Now, the Bartley-Fox gun bill was passed in 1974, and it was passed again as a result of a tremendous amount of violence that was occurring in the society at the time. There are some homicide rates I'll show you now, but I can remember in 1972 the homicide rate in Boston was 135 people. That was 135 people get killed as a result of it. Right now, with all the violence you see on TV, it's about 22. When it peaks, it's usually up to about 30, 35. That goes to show you how dramatically different the crime rate is now from then. So as a result of some of the violence that occurred, the Massachusetts legislature enacted the Bartley-Fox gun bill. It established the following. First, a 2-tiered licensing system. One was for rifles and shotguns, and the other was for handguns, which at that time were regarded with real fear. Okay? Now, it also began to establish qualifiers in Massachusetts for the ability to have and hold licenses respective to each one of those 2 classes. In the case of rifles and shotguns, it was an FID card. In the case of a firearm handgun, it was a license to carry. So the law implemented these standards. First, you could not be a convicted felon and get a license. You could not be a convicted drug user or a person convicted with drug sales and get a license. If you were if you were ever institutionalized in a mental institution, you were prohibited from holding a firearm. So those are the three general categories that you had to go to. You had to apply, you had to be reviewed, you had to look at your record had to be checked, and any of those three qualifiers would prohibit you from owning. The fourth qualification, with regard to handguns, right, was a standard called suitability. Very controversial today. Anybody that follows the handgun debate knows that the suitability issue still is hot. Okay? Suitability gave the chief of police in the local community the right to be able to evaluate you for a license to carry, not for a shotgun or a firearm, a shotgun or a rifle, but for a license to carry. And he or she could deny you that for articulable circumstances. All right? They could deny you that right. In addition, if you were caught in possession of a handgun without a license, you were subject to a mandatory 1-year prison term, which never seemed to really work out. Okay? Columbine came along. I think you remember, we all remember, Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris went in and killed 10 students. I remember the day it happened, and that was the new normal. But when it first happened, it was unheard of. It was a outrageous act of violence. Now it's become commonplace. All right? But that had a very, very significant impact on the Massachusetts gun laws. And what it did was it now took the old license to carry and FID and it modified it. It created two categories of ownership called Class A and Class B ownership. All right? Class A was known as high capacity, included both firearms, handguns, and rifles and shotguns. Class B included handguns and also rifles and shotguns. The FID card still remained for rifles and shotguns. It was still the same situation. However, there were some major changes to the qualifications. You can find one of them is that the Secretary of Public Safety was given regulatory authority to classify the firearms in Massachusetts that would go into the Class A or Class B category. So it interjected a whole sort of a subjective, or that's a good word, thank you, a subjective or a unstable or versatile or changeable feature to the law. You could be 1 year, you could have a weapon that was Class B, and then another year on a regulatory change, it could be a Class A, and you're in violation of the law. And you have to scramble to try to adjust and make things right. Firearm safety courses were mandated as a result of this legislation. The new provision now, however, added certain other additional offenses to prohibit restrictions for people to get Class A, Class B licenses. Now, if you were involved in any violent misdemeanor, you could be prohibited. If you were involved in any sort of a domestic abuse situation, you could be prohibited. And if you violated a numerous set of regulatory proceedings with regards to the maintenance of your weapons, for example, making sure that you had gun locks on them when you're not there, you could lose your license for that. And it would take you on that type of a situation up to 5 years to regain it. Okay? In the situation of crimes, violent crimes, you may never get it back. You may never get it back. Now, there was a lot of hubbub at that time, and there was a lot of one of the things that I think really was a punitive aspect of it was that if you owned an FID card up until that point, an FID card you held until you died. You had it your whole life. Subject to the fact that you weren't arrested, you weren't prosecuted, or you didn't jeopardize your standing. In this case, they made the FID card expirable. So every 6 years it has to get expired. And there were good, hard-working, loyal citizens who were trying to get their FID cards renewed, and they weren't able to do it. And as a result of that, they lost their rights to be able to hold and maintain firearms and rifles and shotguns, which was sort of a outside the door, a backdoor approach to try to get rid of as many weapons in Massachusetts or firearms owners as they could. All right? Now, the next last iteration was the 2014 post-Sandy Hook impacts. Now, everybody remembers Sandy Hook. I remember it. We're going to talk about it a little bit here in a minute. But this really, there was another attempt to, I think, politicize what happened in Sandy Hook and use it as an excuse to attack law-abiding gun owners. And what happened in that case was two things. First of all, one thing was good, one thing was bad. All right. One thing that was good was they dropped the expiration issue on the FID. So if you have an FID card and you own a simple rifle and a shotgun that's not large capacity, and your FID card is expiring, and you want to renew that card, and you submit it to the licensing authority, and they don't get back to you, the day your expiration happens, you don't lose your rights. It's not until they actually pass either they reject or accept your license. That's when it counts. So they gave you a grace period, and I think to the credit of the Gun Owners Action League, I think they were probably chiefly responsible for inserting that back in again. So that made it fair. But one of the things that happened after that was that the suitability standard that once applied to firearms, to handguns, is now extended down to rifles and shotguns, low capacity as well as high capacity. So that brings you into and some would say a subjective situation where the police chief gets to evaluate your suitability. All right? Now, don't get me 100% wrong on the suitability issue. I think it's worked in some cases well in Massachusetts, but I do believe it needs to be tweaked, and I'll explain that to you. Now, how do you get a license, or how do you get a standard? And somebody asked me before we just started off. Well, you got to go to your police station and you have to fill out an application, and it's extensive. And then you have to give your fingerprints. All right, so you have to be above board right off the bat. Once they get the application, the local police chief will send the information in, a copy of it, into the state police. The state police is kind of the clearinghouse for information checks with regards to these types of applications. They will check these following databases: the Department of Mental Health, the Board of Probation, the National Crime Information Center, LEAPS, which is a warrant system, and the court protective orders. There's a database of those. If your name comes up on any one of those, you're going to be denied your application. All right, so that's that. Even if you get a clear bill of health, the chief of police is still going to have the opportunity, or reserves the right, to be able to review your application and to deny you if he believes or she believes there are articulable facts that basically can prevent you from, or makes you not suitable to be able to own a weapon.
Question, sir.
Yep.
Do they check other states' databases or just Massachusetts state databases?
The law only stipulates Massachusetts, at least what I saw. That's something I would ask your local chief of police. All right. I read the law today before I came in, and that's all the law stipulated was the Massachusetts. Now, just so you know, NCIC is a national database. Okay, that's the National Crime Information Center. If you are wanted in the United States, you're going to come up on that. LEAPS is basically a Massachusetts-based warrant system. I do not know whether or not they check records of probation in other states.
I represent a lot of police departments in New Hampshire, and I defend the police chiefs when they deny these. And what we do up there is, just like Ken said, we will go to the NCIC. And if somebody has a domestic crime in another state and they're applying, say, in New Hampshire for a concealed permit, we will deny them based on the federal standards, which are the same. You can't be a felon, you can't be convicted of drugs, you can't have a domestic, and there's a suitability provision, which is generally when we end up in court.
Yes.
Suitability. And that can be for a long history of convictions that don't qualify. So say you repeated drunk driver, or you break into houses, trespass, another thing, you're not a felon yet, chief could say you're not a suitable person. So again, check here in Massachusetts, but I can tell you in the border state, we do check other states as well. Thank you.
Now, let's talk about, I'll take it from what Mike just said. Good to see you. Glad you were there. Let's talk about the due process issue involved. This is a constitutional right, and someone's making a decision to deny you a right to be able to exercise that. There's a provision for it. Okay, I have had some, having run 2 times and hitting over 5,000 doors on each case. I can tell you I've had significant debates about the Second Amendment on people's front lawn, and most of it was favorable. But there are some people who object to the fact that there's any right to be able to restrict your right to bear a weapon at all. And they say it's not found in the Constitution. That's not true. Okay? As I read to you, and that idea that the same thinking that gives you the right also gives the local government the right to regulate you. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. You are the militia. You need to be well-regulated. Okay? That's how that flows. They can't deny you the right to bear arms. The government cannot come in and say, you can't own a weapon. But they can create a series of regulations that can make it a little bit rigorous in order to exercise that right. All right? And that's an important thing to bear in mind when you're having this conversation. Now, we've talked about the police chief's sole discretion. In some places, it is being abused. There are some cities and towns where a police chief ad hoc will deny the right to be able to bear a weapon, all right, without any articulable circumstances, just as a matter of practice. That, I believe, is a violation of someone's constitutional rights. I do believe that. If that were to happen to you, you do have the right of appeal. You can appeal to your district court, and you can make your case, but I will have to tell you that that's a very difficult case to overcome. Okay, a very difficult case to overcome. And there's been a lot of criticism leveled at that suitability provision, and I know that there has been some discussion. I think Gohl has been part of it, and some members of the legislature, most notably, he's retired now, but George Peterson, who was the assistant minority leader, tried to come up with a code of regulations promulgated by the legislature that would identify and enumerate those types of situations that the police chief would utilize to make the determination of suitability. That still has not been done. It's still, in many people's eyes, a very arbitrary and capricious process. So I'm just leaving that for your information, okay? Now, let's talk about some current issues involving the Second Amendment. I'm going to take a few minutes, if you'll indulge me, to pass this out to you. You're welcome to keep these. You don't need them back. Don't mind the Galvin campaign things on the back. I'm not running again. So it's a way of saving. We get a chance to use up some of the old paper. Okay. What the hell happened to it? Oh, here it is. All right. This was a very, very, very. Well, y'all get it, because I think this is a very, very interesting and clarifying set of information for you. Something that you may want to keep. And it'll also illustrate to you how the suitability process can actually work, and why there will be a strong fight to overcome it. But in the interest of justice, we have to try to improve our systems. All right, so these what you have in front of you is a special feature that the New York Times published on October 3rd of this year, and it's called "How They Got Their Guns." And what it does is it traces for you all of the all the gun killings, major mass gun killings in the United States over the last few months and years. And we're going to take just a little walk down. I'm going to show you how. And the point I'm going to try to make in this is that the Constitution recognizes that it's primarily the states that have the right to regulate the use and control of firearms within the confines of the United States Constitution. You're going to see how some states deal with that responsibility. And you've just seen how Massachusetts does it. Okay? So, for example, Chris Harper Mercer, this was the Umpqua College shooting, all right? He was thrown out of the Army with 1 month. He had learning and emotional issues. He had purchased 14 guns legally prior to the incident. There was some question as to whether, if he went before a chief of police to get a license, whether he would have qualified under the suitability statute because of his issue with the Army. In fact, in the state law, if you are dishonorably discharged, you cannot possess. It's one of the disqualifiers for having a weapon, all right, or a firearm. Vesterly Flanagan, that was the gentleman that killed the 2 people down there in Virginia, the 2 members of the news crew. He would have, if he had passed Massachusetts standards, he would have been allowed to have the weapon he had, and we would not have been able to prevent that. Dylan Roof was the individual that killed the 9 church members down in Charleston. It's a horrible act. Had a record of drug possession, which was missed by the FBI examiner. And this kind of indicates a flaw. Much of this is being done over the phone in a gun shop in a place like South Carolina. In Massachusetts, you have to pull out a license and hand it to the clerk, who can go by that license as being legitimate. He'll still check it, but that license is legitimate. This individual was the whole thing the thing that made the difference here was a simple telephone call. That's all it was. There was nothing other than that. If somebody missed it, bang, you saw what happened. John Harbour in Louisiana went out of state, couldn't get one in Louisiana, went out of state in Alabama, bought one and brought it back. Common issue. That's a common issue. And that is a vulnerability. That could have happened here as well. All right. Jalen Ray Freyberg. His father had a protective order, and they forgot to enter it to the criminal database. All right? He would have been prohibited. His guns would have been confiscated in Massachusetts had that had occurred. Chief of police would have been responsible for going down and taking those weapons out of his house. Specialist Ivan Antonio Lopez. That was just walking across the street and buying one and walking out the door. Would not have been allowed in Massachusetts. Could not have happened. Aaron Alexis killed 12 people at the naval base. This one continually blows my mind. This gentleman had a long pattern of unusual behavior. He sought treatment and was a paranoid schizophrenic. That alone should have prohibited him in Massachusetts from qualifying for a weapon or a firearm. The chief would have at least known that when he came in and started talking to people that weren't there. Okay, that is a disqualifier. But this individual went and tried to buy an AR-15 at a gun shop. The individual at the counter, whose primary purpose is commerce, not regulation, denied him the AR-15, but sold him a shotgun instead. And the guy was still talking to somebody that wasn't there. Okay? So that would not have happened in Massachusetts. Adam Lanza, complete tragedy. Adam Lanza went under the radar because his mother enabled him to do it. It's a simple fact. That's the simple fact of that case. He was absolutely unfit, would have been unfit under Connecticut law to own and possess weapons. His mother enabled him, and the result was tragic. His mother was a legitimate gun owner. She provided the weapons for him, provided him with training, and provided him as he was a schizophrenic. Wade Page, again, this guy was a white power man, member. He went and he bought a weapon in Milwaukee, went back and killed several people at a Sikh temple. The fact that he was a member of a hate group by in a town that had made declarations about violence would have precluded the chief on good grounds from ever giving him a license to have a weapon. Other people here, James Holmes, under psychiatric care, would not have been allowed. Oneg El Go legally bought firearms despite the fact that he's a paranoid schizophrenic. Again, suitability evaluation by the chief would have prevented that from happening. Jared Loeffner, long record for possession of drugs, also had some issues about sanity. Again, would not have been able to get them in Massachusetts legally. Major Malik Hassan, I mean, he was the United States Army major. He certainly had access, would not have been able to prevent that. And then Jiverly Way, he bought the weapon legally and went purchase. He was allowed the weapon because the background check did not come back in time. And in the particular state that he was in, which is the practice is, well, if it doesn't come back in time, it opts to your benefit, and you get to take the firearm. So I think you can see that Massachusetts has done a pretty good job of trying to maintain a stable and sensible, sometimes overly protective firearms process, but you can see what the contrast and the difference is in some of the places that don't have this system. All right, And people talk about banning firearms, taking firearms. No, just the states have to take responsibility for regulating this as they're required to under the Second Amendment, and to be able to make sure that proper people get that. The next issue is gang violence. And the Wall Street Journal addressed gang violence. They said that the American legal order, in their opinion, was beginning to fray. This was in the September 14th issue of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, I'm sorry. There was an escalation of violent crime which shows signs of breakdown of basic respect for the law. This comes 2 decades after the most remarkable drop in crime. Now, all across the United States in major cities, the homicides rates are up 20–25%. But nowhere is there a problem as much as there is in Chicago. Right now, Chicago is 446 homicides. That's 20% above where it was last year. They estimate that in Chicago, there are 600 active youth gangs with weapons. There have been 2,213 shootings in 2015. And in the West Garfield Park section of Chicago, which is one section of the town, there were 116 homicides there, and the rate in that section is 116 homicides per 100,000 people. That is like Lowell having basically 116 homicides a year. Can you imagine what the chaos would be like in that city if that were the case? All right. The West Garfield Park section of Chicago is the most violent section on earth when it comes to hand violence. It's beat Honduras, which is like 98 out of 1,000. The national average is 4.5 homicides per 100,000 people. That gives you an idea how this works. Now, Boston has some interesting statistics. Boston, at this rate, is about 22 homicides. I counted it before I came in. That's low from where it has been in the past. It's been up 35, up to 40 in some years. This year, it's low. But the difference is that there are a lot of shootings going on, significant amounts of shootings. The ATF, which is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, decided to study the whole possession of firearms by people involved in these shootings. And they came up with some very, very interesting data that I thought I'd share with you. And the ATF study looked at 3,202 handguns that were seized by the Boston Police Department from 2007 to 2013. 32.4% of these guns were legally purchased. That means 63% or so were not. They were illegally purchased. So outside the bounds of legal regulation. All right. But what was really disturbing was of the 32%, 63% of that were stolen guns that were never reported. That is another violation of the law. If you have and I will caution you this, if, God forbid, you do have a weapon stolen, make sure you know what your serial numbers are, make sure you know what make and model it is, because you are required by law to report that as stolen as soon as it happens. So don't hold back on that. That's a very important requirement that can get you in a lot of trouble if you don't do that. Boston has some issues about policing its own issuance of firearms licenses. Obviously, if there's this many people are not reporting their guns stolen, are they still maintaining licenses, or are they being revoked? Okay. As you can see, the bulk or the majority of the weapons that are used in these urban crimes are illegal weapons. They're not bought and purchased by people who are following the law and utilizing the law to protect themselves. They are underground purchases, and they are involved in a host of killings. Now, there's a lot of concern over this, all right, and a lot of controversy. The police understand this. In the past, they embarked upon a very controversial process called stop and frisk, and the object of the stop and frisk was to try to identify known gang members and then confront them, and under a Terry versus Ohio stop, which allows a police officer to do a cursory pat down for their own protection, be able to identify whether the person had a weapon. They did. They were able to take a lot of weapons off the street as a result. However, as you can see, there is a very, very strong pushback now coming from some members of the community, but primarily from real radical left organizations, in my judgment, that are really trying to obstruct that type of activity. So the police are going to have to find a better way, because obviously the ramifications of this are now starting to become very significant. So let's look at one last thing, and that's terrorism. You've all watched your TV, I'm sure, over the weekend. You've been inundated with one of the most horrific terrorist acts that I've witnessed outside of 9/11, the one that we saw there. But this was a horse of a different color, if you will. The style of this particular homicide, of this particular attack, was a wanton attack purely on personnel, on people, without any objective other than to inflict as many casualties as possible. Now, 129 people were killed in this attack, but what really, in addition to that horrific number, 352 were wounded. The total combined casualty rate of dead and injured would have been the equivalent of an American battalion being wiped out. That's how many people were killed. Am I right? That's about the size of a battalion. That's a major, major loss. Right now, as you watch TV on the news, you go back tonight, it's a minute-by-minute situation developing in Europe and Brussels and Paris and in the Middle East over this entire situation. The French Prime Minister has said that the world is at war. So this is not the first time it's happened. There was a previous attempt in 2008, which this particular assault sort of patterns, and that was the attack by a group called Lashkar-e-Taiba in India back in 2008. They went into Mumbai and they took 164 people were killed in a random attack, just like this. Pure personnel assault. No targets, not trying to disable anything, just to create as much terror and as much bloodshed as they possibly can. Now, this really represents a major challenge. And I think it's pretty clear. I was checking some of the statistics with regards to ISIS, or ISIL, if you will. Right now, that organization controls something like 13,000 square miles in the section called the Levant. They estimate that there are 30 to 50,000 members of ISIL under arms. That's a significant military force. There are, in the United States, an estimated 900 active investigations into ISIS members here, and every state has a series of investigations being conducted. The appeal is directly towards Muslim youth who happen to be disenfranchised, dissatisfied, and have issues. All right, and that's who they're trying to attack. And there needs to be a defined strategy to try to do this. Now, there's limitations in this new battle, and I'm going to put on my security hat just a little bit to discuss those. The traditional security approach is to identify your critical assets, your key assets, targets, harden those so that you will deter your opponent or your adversary from attacking you. This is not the case in this new game. The case here is there are no places to attack. You would have to put everybody into a stalag in order to protect you. Okay? So this is going to open up a whole new challenge for Americans, Homeland Security, as well as all of us, to try to deal with. The only deterrence to mass murder on this scale, obviously, is to secure your borders, make sure that you have a strict immigration control policy, which we don't have. Right? Have an active, proactive police and internal security force presence. And I am at the point now where I believe that the armed citizenry may become a very important part of this. Okay? It may come down to that if this continues. And what we've done is we've gone full circle. We've gone from Groton 1775 to Groton 2015. Complete change, but same threat, same way of handling it. All right? It's ironic. As Winston Churchill says, those that don't know history are doomed to repeat it. I will leave you with this. With regards to the Second Amendment. There is an attempt. There is definitely a school of thought, a powerful school of thought in this country that does not want the Second Amendment to continue as is. I don't think I have to tell you that. I don't think I'm saying anything controversial. All right? But I want you to remember those three personalities that I talked about when I first started, right? When they put the handgun on the table, or you talked about freedom. One ran, okay? One thought they could manipulate it and use it. The other one was sober, deliberate, responsible, and said, I know what this is for, I accept my responsibility, and I will use this for the good. All right? The folks who are against us do not accept nor want that last person. They focus on the other two. And that's what they're trying to profess is the actual American body politic. They don't accept the fact that American citizens can be responsible, that they can take care of themselves. They don't care about that, because if you can take care of yourselves, you don't need the big promises that they're going to offer you. So I want to just leave you with this, all right? If we were ever to have this right taken away from us, the Second Amendment, despite all the ramifications and the wrangling that we're going to have to go through to try to make the law just so that everybody maximizes their rights and we protect people who shouldn't get weapons from getting weapons, despite all that, should the day come when that right is taken away from you, we will cease to be Americans. And I want you to keep that in mind. And thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Go ahead. There are many places that now have passed laws about that. So those toy companies are going to be extremely, for example, the one major one that I think of is the one in Cleveland, Ohio, involving Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy that had an actual life replica. Cleveland police responded to the call. He visually displayed the weapon in the direction of the officer, and the officer shot and killed him. The officer is under extreme scrutiny on that. There's a controversy surrounding that situation. I'm not going to opine on that one way or the other, but I do believe that the toy company that made that particular weapon is going to be on the hook for some serious money. All right, and that's a legitimate thing. They're supposed to mark and identify those to prevent that from happening, and I think they're going to be in trouble for that. I think that right now, I think Massachusetts is going to ban replica weapons, so that you can't have a real replica. You can have a toy, I mean a plastic toy or something like that, but some of these are really realistic-looking weapons, and they were used for training. I don't really know what they were for in the first place. I couldn't conceive of what the purpose was in the first place for having them, but you know, they did manufacture them, and they were sold. No, you're absolutely correct, and I just explained to you the three types of personalities. Okay, the one they really want to discredit is the one that's responsible and willing to be able to maintain and utilize the right to bear arms. And remember something, as I told you as well, the right to bear arms is inextricably tied to your freedom. So whatever they're going to do with those, they're going to do with your freedom eventually. And it has been said that the Second Amendment is actually, of all the Bill of Rights, is the most important because it sustains and protects the rest of the rights that are given to you. And it's important to remember that. Now, there are a lot of people that are going to think what I'm saying is very, very radical and very, I guess you could say, politically incorrect. But I'm willing to stand by this. This is what the United States was about. It's what it is about. And we've got to come to terms with that and decide, do we want to continue to be the United States, or do we want to be something else? I'm opting for the United States of America, okay, because I want my freedom. Well, you're going to have to check the law in the state that you're going to go to, all right? For example, hunters go through this issue all the time. If they're going to go hunt in Virginia, they have to find out what the laws are all the way across, all the way down. But because they're dedicated to what they do and they enjoy the sport, they'll take the time, and because they're law-abiding citizens, they will find out what those are. And generally, you'll find that a lot of states will make accommodation that if your weapon is in a trunk, if it's locked, and you're on a destination to a location to do hunting that they're aware of, they're going to give you the pass on it, okay? And they're going to give you the okay to go through it, providing you're legally registered in your own state. But again, I'm going to tell you, if you're planning to do travel between here and some other state, take the time to make an inquiry into that state and find out exactly what the laws are. Is there an app for that? There you go. You know, your local sportsman's club, all right, it will probably have tons of people who can advise you of those laws. But to your first question, yes, you have to know. There is no excuse for ignorance. You have to know what your rules and what your rights are under the law for self-defense. If you're ever in the position, God forbid, that you have to exercise something like that. Okay, but that's it. So, I hope that answers your question.